Okay, now we're ready for another loop. Let's work with the do while loop. And let's say that I do not want anyone to be able to enter any scores in that are greater than 100. So they can only enter from up to 100, nothing greater than 100. So we have to take the information that makes it work once, make it so that it's indented, and then let's wrap it in a do, and our while. We have to have our condition here. And I won't end this loop as long as my score 1 is greater than 100. Here I'm looking for bad data, not good data. I want them to continuously input information as long as this is true. Now, I would not want to make them enter this information constantly without telling them why I'm making them enter it. So, we've got to have some type of invalid data entry. Now, normally, I'm going to tell it if, and again, normally it is the same condition that's keeping me in the loop. So if this is true, then I want to print them a message that tells them invalid data. So it will come back and say, do these lines of code while this is true. The do while still has all three parts that a loop needs. It's just not as compact as the for loop is. So on this do loop, everything's based on my score 1, which means I still have to have an initializing statement, which I'm working on right here. This just happens to also be the altering statement. And here's my condition that gets me, either keeps me in or gets me out of the loop, whichever way you look at it. Also, this is one of the few times you're going to have a condition with a semicolon directly after it. Normally, this never would happen. Now, one other thing I want you to notice is I kept my running total outside of this loop. That's because anything that I do with a valid score 1 needs to be outside the loop because it's not valid till I make it outside the loop. If I had my totaler inside the loop, then that would mean that I would have a skewed total. It would go too high. When I entered a bad number, it would still get it added to the total. Okay, now we have the do while, we have the for. Either one of these could be a while loop, but just remember back to when we did our explanations. Each loop type has its own area of expertise. Just remember which is a pre-checker and which is a post-checker. Okay. Now, I'll go ahead and do the while loop right now because we could say that I want to be able to enter this information, but then I also want to be able to do it as many times as I want. I want to be able to add and get as many averages until I tell them I'm ready to quit. So everything that made it happen once, I'm going to wrap in a while loop. So while, and I'm going to get an answer from the user of a yes or no, so we can also look at getting string information and translating it to a char. So while, and let's call it my user input, is equal to a lowercase y, but I must also make sure that I repeat the same check, but we also have to look for the uppercase version of the same thing, because lower and uppercase are different. Now we're going to wrap all of this in our loop, and this will continue to happen while that is true, or that is true. So now we have to work with the three parts of the loop. I have to have an initializing statement for this, which means I have to start out with a char called user input, and I need to make sure that it will give me a true the first time through. Okay, so I have my initialization for my top checker. Now I need to go in, and we have our condition that gets us out of the loop or keeps us in. And now I have to have the altering statement. And remember, the altering statement needs to be in the loop. So we're going to have to get a char from the user. But remember, Scanner doesn't have a next char. So I have to be able to get a string and only get the one piece that I need. So I'm going to have to go in here and tell it I want a string, and I'm going to call it str input. Okay. So now I system and I want to tell them do you want to average again y/n. Now we have to be able to take in the user's input, but again, we don't have a next char, but we do have a next. So I'm going to tell it that my string variable, which is str input, is going to be assigned sc.next. And remember, that will give me everything up into a space or an enter key. But I'm only checking for one char. So I have to just take the very first letter out of string input. So now we can tell it that our user input is going to be assigned. I've got to go to the string input, and I want the char at position 0. Remember, computers always start at 0. So if I typed in the word yes, the Y would be at position 0. The E would be at position 1. And if you look close enough, you'll find there's a pattern. The position is always the element number minus 1. So now that I've got my char into my user input, it will hit the curly brace that scopes my while. It will go back up, and as long as this is true, I have in fact have a Y or a lowercase or an uppercase in user input, it will work. Now, I've also got to remember, if I'm going to be doing multiple averages. I need to make sure that my total always starts out at 0 before I start on the next round of score entries. So you want to make sure that you always initialize all of your subtotal and totalers so that I will start with fresh scores for my next student. That pretty well covers the basics of all three loops in the videos that's been produced. Take your time.